The air in the community hall smelled of stale sheet cake and cheap polyester. It was a scent Lillian Joseph had come to associate with the end of things. She stood by the punch bowl, her fingers tracing the condensation on her plastic cup. Across the room, Sarah, a woman 10 years Lillian's junior, was being toasted for her retirement. People laughed, voices bouncing off the linoleum floors of the Atlanta Municipal Building, where Lillian had worked for 32 years. She had spent 3 decades filing the lives of others, ensuring their pensions were secure, while her own life sat in a drawer, gathering dust. "Lillian, sugar, could you grab more napkins from the break room?" a supervisor called out without looking up. Lillian froze. She was 60 today. Not a single person in the room had remembered, despite the small 60 pin she'd pinned to her lapel that morning in a fit of quiet hope. To them, she wasn't a woman celebrating a milestone. She was a fixture. She was the furniture. She didn't get the napkins. Instead, she walked out. The Victorian house in West End was too quiet. It had been quiet since the divorce 5 years ago, and even quieter since her daughter moved to London. Lillian sat at her mother's old mahogany vanity, the wood scarred by time. She reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out a tattered, silk-bound journal. It was her mother's. Her mother, who had spent her life scrubbing floors so Lillian could go to college, only to pass away 2 months after she retired. Lillian opened it to the last page. There, in faded ink, was a list titled Things for the Soul. Most were crossed out. See the ocean, buy a silk dress, learn to bake. But the very last item, written in a shaky hand just weeks before the end, remained stark and unvisited. See the sunrise at Gyeongbokgung Palace. "Korea," Lillian whispered. The word felt heavy, exotic, and entirely impossible. She looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the fine lines around her eyes, maps of every time she had smiled to keep the peace. She saw the silver at her temples. For years, she had been told that 60 was the age where you sit on the porch and wait for the twilight. "I am not waiting," she told the reflection. Her voice cracked, then hardened. "I am not an expiration date." 3 weeks later, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport felt like a battlefield. Lillian stood at gate F-12, the neon signs for the flight to Incheon glowing like a dare. Around her, the world moved in a blur of youth and hurry. Businessmen barked into Bluetooth headsets. Students with backpacks laughed about their upcoming semesters abroad. Lillian felt like an imposter. She wore her best travel suit, a soft cream knit, but her skin felt too tight. In her right hand, she clutched a brand new passport. The navy blue cover was stiff, the gold crest unrubbed. She hadn't owned one in 30 years. To her, it didn't feel like a travel document. It felt like a ticking bomb. If she stepped on that plane, the safe Lillian would blow up. The woman who paid her bills on time and never made a scene would cease to exist. "Final boarding call for flight KE-36 to Seoul," the agent's voice crackled. Lillian's hands began to shake, a fine rhythmic tremor that made the passport rattle against her knuckles. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You're too old for this. You don't even speak the language. What if you get lost? What if you die alone in a hotel room?" The voices of her sisters, her ex-husband, and her neighbors echoed in her head. "At your age, Lillian, be sensible." She looked down at the passport. Then, she looked at her mother's journal tucked into her carry-on. She took a breath, deep and jagged, and stepped forward. She handed the ticket to the agent. The scanner beeped, a sharp, definitive sound that severed her from her past. As she walked down the jet bridge, the air became pressurized and cool. Her legs felt like lead, but she kept moving. She didn't know that on the other side of that cabin door, in a seat she hadn't yet found, her life was waiting to begin. She stepped into the plane, clutching her trembling hands to her chest, and boarded the flight that would change the map of her world forever. The cabin of the Boeing 747 hummed with the low-frequency vibration of a giant settling into its stride. Lillian found seat 44K, a window seat far behind the massive engines. She stowed her small carry-on with a grunt of effort, her joints reminding her that she was 60, not 16. She sat down, her heart still performing a nervous flutter in her throat. She stared out at the gray tarmac of Atlanta, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. "Hello." The voice was deep, resonant, and carried an unexpected smoothness. Lillian looked up and blinked. The man standing in the aisle looked like he had been carved out of obsidian and silk. He wore a simple, charcoal gray cashmere hoodie and dark trousers, casual, yet expensive, in a way that didn't need to scream. His hair was thick and dark, peppered with just enough silver at the temples to give him a distinguished air. He looked to be roughly her age, perhaps a few years younger, but his eyes were ancient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too many spreadsheets and not enough sunsets. He settled into the cramped economy seat with a heavy sigh, his long legs struggling to find space. He didn't look at her. He simply leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Kang Ha-yun was hiding. 6 hours ago, he had been in a boardroom in Manhattan, watching his cousins attempt to dismantle his life's work, while his phone buzzed with emergency calls from women who only wanted to know if he'd be attending the spring gala. He had traded his first-class ticket for the last available seat in the back of the plane. He didn't want a hot towel. He didn't want a glass of Dom Perignon. He wanted to be a ghost. 5 hours over the Pacific, the world fell apart. The fasten seatbelt sign didn't just flash. It chimed like an alarm. The plane suddenly dropped, a sickening, stomach-turning plunge that sent a chorus of gasps through the cabin. Then came the shuddering. It wasn't a vibration. It was the aircraft being thrashed by an invisible giant. Lillian gasped, her eyes flying open. She gripped the armrest so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, her breath hitching. "Oh, sweet Jesus, not now." Beside her, she felt the man stiffen. She glanced over and saw his eyes were wide, fixed on the seat back in front of him. His right hand was gripped into a white-knuckled fist on his thigh. He wasn't just uncomfortable, he was terrified. Lillian's own terror peaked, then did something strange. It curdled into a sudden, sharp clarity. She saw his fear, a raw human thing, and the mother of the West End took over. "Honey," she said, her southern drawl thickening with comfort, "look at me." Ha-yun turned his head slowly. He expected to see a screaming stranger. Instead, he saw a woman with skin like deep mahogany and eyes that held the steady warmth of a hearth fire. "Take a breath," she commanded gently. She reached out and placed her hand directly over his frozen fist. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to his cold sweat. "The wings are built to bend, not break. My daddy was a mechanic. He used to tell me planes are just birds made of math. We're gonna be fine." The plane bucked again, harder this time. Someone a few rows back screamed. "Shh," Lillian murmured, squeezing his hand. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small, crinkled yellow wrapper. "Here, take this. It's a ginger candy. My mama always said you can't be scared if your mouth is busy with ginger." Ha-yun stared at the candy as if it were a rare diamond. No one had offered him a sweet since he was a boy. No one had touched his hand to comfort him in decades. He unwrapped it with trembling fingers and popped it into his mouth. The spicy, sharp heat hit his tongue, grounding him. "Tell me something," Lillian said, her voice a steady anchor against the rattling of the cabin. "Tell me where you're going." "Home," he rasped. "Seoul." "Well, I'm going there too," she smiled, though her own heart was still racing. "It's my first time. I spent 60 years in Georgia. You ever been to Georgia? We got trees that grow so thick you can't see the sun, and the air smells like honeysuckle and rain. I used to sit on my porch and watch the lightning bugs. She kept talking. She told him about the red clay of the South, about the Sunday potlucks where the mac and cheese was so good it was sinful, and about the time her dog, Buster, tried to fight a lawn sprinkler. Hyun listened. He didn't hear a commoner or an American tourist. He heard a soul. For the first time in 20 years, the weight of the Kang Group, the board members, and the billions of one disappeared. He wasn't the chairman. He was just a man in seat 44J, being kept alive by the voice of the woman in 44K. By the time the turbulence subsided into a dull vibration, Hyun's hand had relaxed under hers. He didn't pull away. You have a very brave heart, Lillian Joseph, he said, reading her name from the tag on her bag. I'm terrified out of my mind, sugar, she admitted with a soft, tired laugh. I'm just better at hiding it behind a story. Hyun looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the grace in her silver hair and the authenticity in her smile. He felt a pull in his chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. I think, Hyun said quietly, that you are the most interesting thing to happen to this flight. Lillian chuckled, patting his hand one last time before finally letting go. Go on now. Try to sleep. You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders, and that's too much weight for a 14-hour flight. As he closed his eyes, Hyun didn't think about his upcoming board meeting. He thought about ginger candies and honeysuckle, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to land. The wheels touched down at Incheon International with a definitive smoky thud. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the cabin lights flickered on, harsh and unforgiving. Lillian felt the sudden weight of her 60 years returning, the stiffness in her knees, the puffiness of her ankles. Well, she said, giving a small, weary smile to the man in 44J. We made it. Math and ginger candies. The man? Hyun didn't return the smile immediately. He was staring at the window, his expression shifting. The vulnerability she had seen over the Pacific was being walled off, brick by brick, right before her eyes. The slouch in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a spine of tempered steel. Yes, he said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding less like a traveler and more like an edict. We made it. As the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, the usual chaos of deplaning began. Lillian struggled with her heavy knit cardigan and her bag, fumbling for her mother's journal. Allow me, Hyun said. He reached up, his movements fluid and authoritative, and retrieved her bag from the overhead bin. He didn't just hand it to her, he held it as they walked down the aisle together. Lillian felt a strange sense of protection, as if she were walking beside a silent thunderstorm. Then, they stepped through the cabin door and into the jet bridge. Lillian stopped so abruptly that the passenger behind her bumped into her shoulder. She didn't notice. Lined up against the walls of the jet bridge were 2 rows of men. They were all young, fit, and dressed in identical razor-sharp black suits with earpieces curled behind their ears. As Hyun stepped forward, the entire group snapped their heels together and bent at the waist in a perfect synchronized 90-degree bow. Chairman! They shouted in a booming unison that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. Lillian's heart took a panicked leap. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had eaten her ginger candy and listened to stories about Georgia lightning bugs. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He handed her bag to the nearest suit without looking, his gaze fixed forward. He wasn't a traveler anymore. He was a monument. A younger man in a navy suit stepped forward, his face pale and sweating. Chairman Kang, the motorcade is waiting. The emergency board meeting was moved up to... Hyun held up a single hand. The young man fell instantly silent, his mouth snapping shut. Hyun turned to Lillian. The black suit sea seemed to part instinctively, creating a pocket of silence just for them. The guards were staring at her, an older black woman in a cream knit suit, looking confused and travel-worn, with blatant, disciplined curiosity. "Lillian," Hyun said. The steel in his voice softened, but only for her. You're a chairman?" she whispered, her voice feeling small in the cavernous space. "I was mothering a billionaire?" A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, the first sign of the man from seat 44J. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black card with nothing but a gold embossed name and a private number. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering on hers, just long enough to remind her of the turbulence. He leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and expensive soap clouding her senses. "You saved me from the turbulence, Lillian Joseph," he whispered near her ear. "Now please, let me save you from the city." He looked at the lead guard. "See that this lady is fast-tracked through VIP customs. If a single hair on her head is troubled, I will have your resignation." "Yes, Chairman." Before Lillian could find her breath, Hyun was swept away. He moved at the center of a black-suited phalanx, a king reclaiming his territory. 2 hours later, Lillian sat on the edge of a thin bed in a tiny traditional Hanak Airbnb in Insadong. The room was beautiful, wood-beamed ceilings and the scent of dried paper. But it felt like a cage. Her hands were shaking again, worse than they had been at the gate in Atlanta. She looked at the black card sitting on the low wooden table. It felt like a hot coal. She had come here to find her mother's dream, to be anonymous, to prove she could exist on her own. She hadn't come here to be a project for a man who owned half the skyline. The roar of the city outside, the neon lights, the screaming Korean signage, the sheer strangeness of it all, pressed in on her. She felt like an ant under a microscope. "I can't do this," she whispered to the empty room. She reached for her suitcase, ready to pack, ready to find the next flight back to the safety of her quiet, invisible life in Georgia. But then she opened her mother's journal. "See the sunrise?" the ink pleaded. Lillian looked at the card again. She didn't call the number. Instead, she tucked it deep inside her passport, stood up, and locked the door. She wasn't ready to be saved yet. She had to see if she could survive the first night on her own. The morning in Insadong was a watercolor of gray mist and the smell of toasted sesame. Lillian stood on the cobblestone street, clutching a paper map like a shield. She had spent the last hour trying to find a simple bakery, but the vibrant vertical neon of Seoul felt like a language she couldn't even hum, let alone speak. Every time she paused, the city rushed past her. Young people in oversized trench coats navigated the crowds with the precision of schools of fish, their eyes glued to shimmering smartphones. Lillian felt like a boulder in a fast-moving stream. When she tried to ask a shopkeeper for directions, the woman gave her a polite, hurried bow and a look of sheer panic at the English words, moving quickly to a younger customer. "Invisible," Lillian whispered, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. In Atlanta, she was invisible because she was a secretary of a certain age. Here, she was invisible because she was a ghost from a different world. Her knees ached. The weight of age wasn't just a metaphor. It was the sharp thrum in her lower back and the way her eyes struggled to adjust to the frantic pace of the digital signage. She found a stone bench and sat, feeling small. She pulled out her mother's journal. "Find the moon-scented tea house," her mother had written. "It's tucked away where the modern world forgets to look." Lillian sighed. She had told the man on the plane about this place. She had described it using her mother's old descriptions. The blue-tiled roof, the garden with the white pines. At the time, it had been a way to soothe a terrified stranger. Now, it was her only North Star. 30 floors above the city, the air was conditioned to a crisp, sterile chill. Kang Hyun, sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 40. Around him, men in expensive suits debated quarterly projections and brand sentiment. Hyun's face was a mask of impassive granite, but his thumb was tracing a rhythmic circle on his palm, the exact spot where a woman's warm hand had rested during a storm. Chairman, regarding the semiconductor merger. Hyun didn't look up. Postpone it. A ripple of shocked silence went around the room. Sir, the board can wait, Hyun said, his voice like the snap of a winter branch. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. He looked at his personal assistant, a man who had served him for 15 years. Secretary Cho, does the moon-scented tea house still exist in the old quarter? Cho blinked, surprised. Yes, Chairman. It is a heritage site now. Very quiet. Not popular with the younger demographic. Cancel my afternoon, Hyun commanded, already walking toward the private elevator. And Cho, lose the security detail. I want one car. Unmarked. Lillian finally found it. The tea house was a sanctuary of dark wood and sliding paper doors. It smelled of damp earth and roasted barley. She sat on a silk cushion at a low table, her legs tucked uncomfortably to the side, watching the rain begin to patter against the courtyard's white pines. She felt a deep, sudden ache of loneliness. She had made it to the place in the journal, but she had no one to tell. She reached into her bag to pull out her phone, intending to take a picture for her daughter, when the sliding door at the entrance creaked open. A man stepped in. He wasn't wearing the chairman armor. He was back in a simple dark sweater, his hands in his pockets. He looked around the dim room until his eyes landed on her. The tension in his jaw visibly evaporated. Lillian froze, a teacup halfway to her lips. You, she breathed. How did you? Hyun walked across the polished floor, his movements soft. He didn't tower over her. He sat on the cushion across from her, moving with the grace that suggested he had spent his life in rooms like this. You told me this was the first place you wanted to see, he said. His voice was no longer the boom of the jet bridge. It was the low hum of seat 44J. You said your mother described the white pines. I realized I have lived in this city for 60 years, and I had never seen them. Lillian looked at him, searching for the ego, the power, the chairman who had commanded a sea of black suits. She found only the man who had been afraid of the clouds. You tracked me down, she said, her southern defensive reflex kicking in. That's a bit much, don't you think, sugar? Hyun shook his head slowly. I didn't track you. I simply came to the only place in Seoul that felt like the stories you told me. I hoped you would be here. If you weren't. He paused, looking at the rain. I think I would have sat here and waited until the tea went cold. He looked back at her, his gaze intense and startlingly sincere. In that boardroom, everyone looks at me and sees a crown. On that plane, you looked at me and saw a person. I find I'm not ready to go back to being a crown just yet. Lillian felt the invisible feeling begin to melt. For the first time since she landed, someone wasn't looking through her. They were looking at her. The tea is barley, she said softly, pushing a cup toward him. It's supposed to be good for the heart. Hyun took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. I believe it's working already. The tea house had been a prelude. The evening was the symphony. Hyun led Lillian through a narrow back exit, bypassing the main street where his driver waited. He walked with a newfound lightness, guiding her toward a vintage, understated sedan parked in a shadow. For the first time in years, he was behind the wheel himself. Where are we going? Lillian asked, clutching her purse. I'm not dressed for a palace, Hyun. Good, he said, the corner of his eye crinkling, because we aren't going to a palace. We are going to the only place in Seoul where I'm just the man who likes spicy noodles. He drove her to a small, neon-soaked neighborhood in the foothills of Namsan. They ended up at a pojangmacha, a bright orange street-side tent, where the steam from simmering vats of odeng blurred the glass. The owner, an elderly woman with skin like a sun-dried plum, shouted a greeting at Hyun, calling him young man and shooing them toward a plastic table. She doesn't know, Lillian whispered, eyeing the chairman of a global empire sitting on a red plastic stool. She knows I pay my bill and I like extra green onions, Hyun replied. To her, that is my entire resume. Over bowls of steaming noodles and small glasses of barley tea, the chairman and the secretary began to peel back the layers they had worn for 60 years. 30 years, Lillian said, her voice dropping as she stared into the amber depths of her tea. I gave that man my youth, my back, and my best prayers. I thought if I was just enough, he would stay. But apparently, enough has an expiration date. He left me for a girl who wasn't even born when we bought our first house. He told me I'd become comfortable, like I was an old chair he was tired of sitting in. She looked at her hands, the hands that had typed his resumes and raised their child. I came here because I wanted to see if there was anything left of me that wasn't comfortable or useful. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Hyun reached across the small plastic table. He didn't just touch her hand this time. He took it, his thumb tracing the line of her wrist. You are not a ghost, Lillian. You are the only solid thing I have touched in years. He looked away, his gaze fixing on the steam rising from the kitchen. My war was different, but the wounds looked the same. I was born into a throne. I didn't marry a woman. I married a merger. My wife was chosen for her father's shipping lanes. We lived together for 25 years like two strangers sharing a very expensive elevator. He let out a short, dry laugh. When she passed away 5 years ago, the first thing my directors asked wasn't if I was grieving. They asked how it would affect the stock price. I have 3 children who view me as a trust fund with a pulse. I am surrounded by thousands of people every day, and yet, until seat 44K, I hadn't spoken a word of truth to anyone in a decade. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the bustling Seoul night muffled by the plastic walls of the tent. We're just 2 survivors, aren't we? Lillian murmured. Survivors of different wars, Hyun agreed. You were discarded for being too much of a person, and I was discarded for being too little of one. They made us both feel invisible. He leaned in closer, the orange light of the tent reflecting in his dark, steady eyes. But I see you, Lillian Joseph. I see the woman who walked onto a plane alone at 60. I see the woman who hums when she's nervous, and I find her extraordinary. Lillian felt a flush that had nothing to do with the spicy broth. For the first time in 30 years, she wasn't being looked at as a wife, a mother, or a clerk. She was being seen as a woman. You're a smooth talker for a man who lives in a boardroom, she teased, though her voice trembled. I'm a man who has finally found something worth talking about, he replied softly. The morning was too bright. It felt like a spotlight on a stage Lillian had never asked to climb. She was standing at a small fruit stall in Insadong, trying to remember the Korean word for apple, when she noticed the shift. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny shutters. People weren't looking at the fruit anymore. They were looking at her, then back at their phones, then back at her with a mixture of shock and disdain. A group of teenagers whispered the word Halmione, grandmother, hissing through the air like a localized storm. One of them held up a phone screen. There it was. A grainy but unmistakable photo from the night before. Hyun, the lion of Seoul, was leaning across a plastic table in a tent, his head thrown back in a genuine, unforced laugh. And she was there, her hand resting near his, her face glowing with a radiance she hadn't felt in decades. The headline, translated by her phone's camera app, felt like a slap, The chairman's senior scandal. Who is the mysterious foreign grandmother? In the glass and steel fortress of the Kong Group headquarters, the air was thick with the scent of panic and expensive cologne. She is 60, Vice Chairman Min screamed, slamming a tablet onto the mahogany table. She is an American clerk, a nobody. The public was expecting a merger with the Shin family heiress. Haeyun, our stock plummeted 3 points this morning because the investors think you've had a mental breakdown. Haeyun sat at the head of the table, his fingers laced together. He looked bored, but his eyes were the color of a winter sea before a gale. She has a name. It is Lillian Joseph. It doesn't matter what her name is, Min retorted. The netizens are calling her an opportunist. They are saying she targeted you because you're a lonely widower. They're calling her a silver trap. We need to issue a statement. We say she was a former associate's widow, and you were simply showing her hospitality. We bury this today. I will not lie about her, Haeyun said, his voice quiet and terrifying. Then you will lose the chairmanship, Min whispered. Choose carefully, Haeyun. Is a flight-bound crush worth the empire? Back in her small Airbnb, Lillian felt the walls closing in. She had made the mistake of looking at the comments. She looks older than his mother. Is this a joke? Where did she even come from? A gold digger with gray hair. How bold. The words broken didn't begin to cover it. She felt humiliated. She had spent 60 years being the good woman, the invisible worker, the faithful wife. To have her dignity stripped away by millions of strangers who saw her as a punchline was a special kind of agony. She looked at her suitcase, still half-packed from her moment of doubt the first day. She felt like an old fool. She had allowed herself to believe, for a few hours under an orange tent, that she could be a lead character. I'm just a tourist, she sobbed, throwing her mother's journal into her bag. I'm just an old woman who got lost. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from the private number on the black card. Lillian, don't look at the screens. I am coming to you. She stared at the message, her tears blurring the glass. She didn't reply. Instead, she pulled her passport out. The one that felt like a ticking bomb. It was time to go home to Atlanta, where she could be invisible in peace. She reached for the door handle, her heart set on the airport, but as she opened it, she found the hallway blocked, not by paparazzi, but by the one thing she feared more. The weight of Haeyun's world, waiting for her to decide if she was brave enough to stay. The taxi was idling at the curb, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that sounded like a countdown. Lillian stood in the narrow doorway of her hanok, her suitcase handle slippery against her sweating palm. She had her sunglasses on, not because of the sun, but because her eyes were red and she felt like a target. Lillian, see? The driver called out, checking his watch. She took one step toward the car, and then she heard it. A collective gasp from a group of people standing outside a nearby electronics shop. They were crowded around a wall of television screens, their faces illuminated by a flickering blue light. Lillian paused, her heart hammering. On every single screen, a familiar face appeared. It was the annual launch of the Kang Group's newest flagship technology, an event usually watched by millions for its sleekness and corporate theater. But Chairman Kang Haeyun hadn't even mentioned the new phone yet. He stood at the center of the stage, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Lillian's house in Atlanta. But as the camera zoomed in for a close-up, the audience went silent. On his right wrist, peeking out from beneath a $1,000 French cuff, was a braided string of neon blue and yellow yarn. It was the safety bracelet Lillian had woven for her granddaughter and kept in her purse, the one she had jokingly tied onto Haeyun's wrist during the turbulence when he couldn't stop shaking. I have been asked many questions this morning, Haeyun's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing down the streets of Insadong. It was steady, resonant, and carried the weight of a man who no longer feared the fall. Questions about a guest in our city, questions about her age, her background, and her place beside me. Lillian dropped her suitcase. The handle hit the cobblestones with a dull thud. The world sees a scandal, Hyun continued, his eyes burning into the lens as if he could see Lillian through the glass. I see the only person in 30 years who looked at me and didn't see a stock price. I see a woman of grace, of history, and of immense courage. She didn't come to Korea to find a chairman. She came to honor her mother's memory. She is a guest who taught me how to breathe again when the air felt thin. He raised his wrist, the cheap yarn bracelet vivid against his skin. I do not care for the opinions of those who think beauty has an expiration date. Lillian Joseph has my deepest respect and my protection. To insult her is to insult the Kang group. The crowd at the shop window began to murmur, the atmosphere shifting from mockery to a stunned, hushed reverence. In Korea, a public declaration of this magnitude was more than a statement. It was a coronation. The taxi driver's eyes were wide as he looked from the screen to Lillian. He hopped out of the car, but instead of taking her bags to the airport, he bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Before Lillian could process the silence, 3 black sedans drifted to a stop at the end of the alley. This time, Secretary Cho stepped out. He didn't look like a corporate shark. He looked like a man on a mission of mercy. Lillian Nim, Cho said, bowing deeply. The chairman was afraid you wouldn't be here when he finished his speech. He has prepared a place for you, somewhere the world cannot reach you unless you invite them in. I was leaving, Lillian whispered, her voice trembling. The chairman knows, Cho said softly, gesturing to the car. He said if you still wish to leave after tonight, he will fly you home himself. But first, he asked that you let him show you what it feels like to be seen. Lillian looked back at the screen. Hyun was stepping off the stage, ignoring the shouting reporters, his hand instinctively covering the blue and yellow yarn on his wrist. She turned away from the taxi. She walked toward the black sedan. An hour later, the gates of the Kang estate swung open. The villa wasn't a room. It was a sanctuary of glass and cedar nestled into the side of a mountain, overlooking a forest of maple trees. It was quiet. It was safe. And on the bedside table was a small bowl of ginger candies and a single handwritten note in English. You are not a ghost here. You are the light. The silence in the grand dining hall of the Kang estate was so thick it felt pressurized. The room was a masterpiece of cold marble and ancient celadon, lit by a chandelier that dripped with enough crystal to buy a city block in Atlanta. At the head of the table sat the Grand Dowager, Madame Kang. At 80, she was a hawk in a silk hanbok, her eyes 2 chips of flint that had spent decades calculating the worth of everyone she encountered. Beside her sat Hyun's adult children, Jinsun, a sharp-featured woman in her 30s with a shark smile, and Do-hyun, who looked like a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Lillian sat across from them. She had traded her knit suit for a simple, elegant navy dress. She felt like a foreign object in a museum, but she kept her back straight. She had dealt with demanding church deacons and angry bureaucrats for 30 years. She wasn't about to be rattled by people who had never done their own laundry. Tea? Jinsun asked, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. She poured it with aggressive precision. It must be so overwhelming for you, Mrs. Joseph, to go from a small life in the American suburbs to this. The culture shock alone must be exhausting at your age. Lillian took a slow, measured sip. It's different, certainly, she replied, her southern drawl steady and honeyed. But back home, we have a saying, a porch is a porch, whether it's made of pine or marble. People are mostly the same everywhere. Some are kind, and some are just loud. Do-hyun let out a short, mocking huff. Let us be direct. My father is a man of vast resources. He is currently in a state of emotional fatigue. You were there at the right time with what was it? A piece of candy? It's a charming story, but we are prepared to offer you a very comfortable retirement gift to return to Georgia. $1 million. 5. Whatever it takes for you to realize this romance is a logistical impossibility. Hyun, sitting at the foot of the table, began to stand, his face darkening with a silent, lethal fury. Lillian put a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. She didn't look at the children. She looked directly at Madame Kang. Lillian said, her voice dropping into a conversational tone that felt more dangerous than a shout. I spent 30 years as a secretary. I've seen men like your grandson try to buy their way out of things they're too scared to face. But money is just paper if you don't have the character to back it up. She turned her gaze to Do-hyun. Sugar, $1 million couldn't buy the way your father looked at me when the plane was shaking. You're talking about his resources, but you haven't mentioned his happiness once. It's a shame. You're so busy counting his money that you've forgotten to count his heartbeat. Madame Kang's eyes narrowed. You speak very boldly for a guest. I'm 60 years old, Madame, Lillian said, a genuine, fearless smile breaking across her face. I've survived a divorce, a recession, and raising a daughter on my own. I've run out of things to be afraid of. What are you going to do? Tell me I don't belong? I already know that. But I also know that your son finally started laughing again because I didn't treat him like a business deal. Lillian picked up a small rice cake, inspecting it. And as for logistics, I've managed a municipal budget for 3 decades. I think I can handle a dinner party without tripping over the rug. A heavy silence followed. Jinsen looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Do-hyun was turning a dull shade of red. Then the unexpected happened. The Grand Dowager let out a dry, raspy sound that was unmistakably a chuckle. She looked at Hyun, then back at Lillian. She has more spine than the last 3 heiresses we brought in here, the old woman remarked in Korean, though her eyes stayed locked on Lillian's. She switched back to accented English. Sit, Mrs. Joseph. Eat your rice cake. It seems my son has finally developed a taste for something substantial. Hyun let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He looked at Lillian, his chest swelling with a pride so visible it was almost a physical warmth. Lillian winked at him. The invisible woman from Atlanta had just won her first war in Seoul. The golden hour in Seoul was different from the one in Atlanta. Here, the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers like a coin falling into a slot, turning the glass towers into pillars of fire. Lillian sat in the library of the Kang estate, surrounded by leather-bound books and the hum of a world she was finally starting to understand. Her phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was an international number. Hello? Lil? Is that really you? The voice was like a ghost rattling a chain. It was Greg, the man who had looked at her 5 years ago and seen a finished product. The man who had walked away because he wanted someone whose skin didn't tell stories of the decades they'd shared. Greg, Lillian said, her voice surprisingly flat. There was no racing heart, no surge of anger, just a profound sense of distance. I saw you on the news, Lil. CNN International. You look incredible. They're calling you the Grace of the East. Look, I've been thinking. Things with Tiffany, it was a mistake. I was going through something. Seeing you over there with that chairman, it made me realize what I threw away. I'm booking a flight. We can talk, maybe try. Lillian looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She saw the grace he was talking about, but she knew it hadn't come from the silk dress. It had come from the 14-hour flight, the ginger candies, and the courage to be seen. Greg, she interrupted softly, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And for the first time in my life, I'm making mine. Don't book the flight. I'm not the woman you left in Atlanta. That woman finally retired. She hung up before he could respond, feeling a 30-pound weight lift off her shoulders. But the peace was short-lived. The library door swung open. Hyun stepped in, his tie loosened, his face a mask of controlled exhaustion. Behind him, Secretary Cho carried a stack of digital tablets. "They're moving, Chairman," Cho said, his voice urgent. "Vice Chairman Min has leaked documents to the Financial Supervisory Service. They're alleging that the personal gifts and the villa you've provided for Mrs. Joseph were purchased with embezzled funds from the R&D budget. They've tied the wire transfers to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." Hyun rubbed his temples. "It's a frame-up. Min has been layering these accounts for months, waiting for a distraction. My relationship with Lillian was the catalyst he needed to make me look like I'm losing my mind and my ethics." Lillian stood up. "Let me see those." Both men looked at her, surprised. "I spent 32 years as a senior legal secretary for the City of Atlanta's pension board," Lillian said, stepping toward the desk. She put on her reading glasses with a sharp, familiar click. "I've seen every way a man can try to hide a dollar. I've survived 3 state audits and a federal racketeering investigation. Show me the ledgers." For the next 4 hours, the Grace of the East disappeared. In her place was the woman who had kept the gears of a city running. Lillian spread the digital documents across the monitors. Her eyes moved with predatory precision, spotting the inconsistencies that Hyun's high-priced younger accountants had missed because they were looking for complex algorithms, not old-fashioned clerical errors. "There," Lillian pointed, her finger tapping a line item from 6 months ago. The R&D transfer was backdated. Look at the timestamp on the digital signature. It's Greenwich Mean Time, but the entry was made during a holiday weekend when the Seoul servers were down for maintenance. He stole this money a year ago to cover his own gambling debts and just now moved the blame into a file with Hyun's name on it. She looked up at Hyun, a spark in her eyes he'd never seen before. "He's a sloppy thief, Hyun. He thought he could hide it behind your name." Hyun stared at the screen, then at her. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He didn't just see a woman he loved, he saw a partner. "Secretary Cho," Hyun said, his voice dropping into a lethal purr. "Call the prosecutor's office. It seems we have a clerical error to report." The victory over Vice Chairman Min had been swift and total. The boardrooms were quiet. The scandals were replaced by headlines praising the chairman's sharp eye, and the air in the Kang estate felt lighter. But for Lillian, the silence was deafening. They were standing on the private terrace of the villa, the city of Seoul shimmering like a spilled box of jewels below them. Hyun turned to her, the moonlight catching the silver at his temples. He didn't have a sea of black suits behind him tonight. He was just the man who had shared her ginger candies. "Lillian," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he usually kept under lock and key. He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. Inside sat a ring. Not a gaudy corporate diamond, but a deep, rare blue sapphire that matched the color of the sky during the turbulence. "I spent 60 years building a kingdom I didn't want to live in. I don't want to spend another day in it without the woman who taught me how to fly. Will you marry me?" Lillian looked at the ring. It was a promise of safety, of luxury, of never being invisible again. But as she looked at it, she felt a familiar, cold prickle of fear. She saw the chairman's wife. She saw the scheduled galas, the security details, the way her name would forever be an appendage to his. She saw herself becoming a fixture in a palace, just as she had been a fixture in the Atlanta Municipal Building. "Hyun," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I love you. I think I've loved you since you gripped my hand over the Pacific. But I just got my passport. I just found Lillian again." She looked him in the eyes, her heart aching at the hope she saw there. "If I say yes right now, I'm saying yes because I'm afraid of being alone at 60. And I promised myself I would never make a decision out of fear again." Hyun's face fell, a crack appearing in his granite composure. "You're leaving?" "I need a week," Lillian said. "No drivers, no black cards, No chairman. I need to go to the coast. I need to see if I can stand on my own 2 feet in a country where I don't know the words, just to see if I'm still there. The next morning, the Lion of Seoul did something that shocked his entire staff. He didn't argue. He didn't use his resources to block her travel or guilt her into staying. He stood at the entrance of the Seoul station, watching as Lillian adjusted her backpack. She was dressed in sturdy walking shoes and a simple linen shirt. She looked like any other traveler, save for the glow in her skin. 1 week, Hyun said, his hands clasped behind his back to keep from reaching out and pulling her to him. I will be at the moon-scented tea house in 7 days. If you are not there, I will know you have gone back to Atlanta, and I will let you go, because I love you more than I want to own you. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering goodbye that tasted like salt and wood smoke. Lillian took the KTX train to Busan. She spent the first 3 days lost. She stayed in a small guest house where she had to share a kitchen with 2 Australian backpackers and a grandmother who taught her how to fold dumplings without using a single English word. She walked along the Hyundai beach, the wind off the Sea of Japan whipping her silver hair into a frenzy. She ate spicy seafood noodles at a plastic table in a crowded fish market, navigating the transaction with a translation app and a lot of pointing. She fell. She got frustrated. She cried once when she couldn't find her way back to the bus stop. But on the 4th day, standing on the cliffs of Taijeongdae, watching the waves smash against the rocks, she realized something profound. She wasn't a chairman's wife. She wasn't a secretary. She wasn't an ex-wife. She was Lillian Joseph, a woman who had navigated a foreign country alone at 60. She was a woman who could spot a fraud, comfort a titan, and find her way home in the dark. She didn't need Hyun to make her visible. She was already standing in the light. And because she didn't need him to survive, she realized she finally knew how to want him for the right reasons. Lillian stood on the jagged black volcanic rocks, the wind whipping her hair into a silver halo. She had spent the last 2 days in a small cottage owned by a haenyeo, one of the legendary elderly female divers of Korea. Watching these women, some in their 70s and 80s, plunge into the freezing depths of the ocean to harvest abalone, Lillian felt a tectonic shift in her spirit. They weren't retired. They weren't waiting. They were fierce, vital, and deeply visible. She realized then that Hyun hadn't fallen for her because she was a damsel in distress. He had fallen for her because, even when she was terrified, she had reached out to steady him. He didn't want a decoration for his palace. He wanted the woman who knew how to survive a storm. Lillian looked at her reflection in a tide pool. The invisible woman from Atlanta was gone. In her place was a woman who had navigated a foreign country, outsmarted a corporate shark, and held the heart of a king without losing her own. She pulled the black card from her passport and looked at it. She didn't call the number. She just smiled, tucked it back in, and went to buy a train ticket back to Seoul. The moon-scented tea house was exactly as they had left it. Quiet, smelling of damp earth and ancient wood. Hyun was already there. He was sitting at the same low table, staring at the white pines. He looked older than he had a week ago, the lines of anxiety etched deep around his eyes. He didn't have his phone out. He didn't have his guards. He was just a man waiting for the sun to rise. When the sliding door creaked open, he didn't move at first, as if he were afraid his mind was playing tricks on him. Then, he smelled the faint scent of her peach blossom perfume. He turned, and the relief that flooded his face was so raw, it made Lillian's breath hitch. He started to stand, but she held up a hand. "Sit, Hyun," she said, her voice resonant and steady. "Before we talk about us, we need to talk about me." She sat across from him, but she didn't tuck her legs away or look down. She leaned forward, placing a single sheet of paper on the table between them. "I'm 60, Lillian began. "I've spent 40 of those years following someone else's schedule. I'm not trading a municipal office for a marble cage. I love you, but I won't be a chairman's wife who spends her days choosing flower arrangements and nodding at board members. Hyun listened, his eyes locked on hers. Tell me what you want, Lillian. I want a partnership, she said. I'm an accountant by trade and a survivor by choice. I've been looking at the poverty rates for the elderly in the city and the way women my age are discarded. I want to start a foundation. The Ginger Tree will provide legal aid and financial literacy for seniors starting over. I want my own office, my own staff, and a seat at the table that isn't just because I'm wearing your ring. She tapped the paper. This is my contract. I will be your wife, and I will love you with everything I have, but I will also be my own woman. If you want a queen who just waves from the balcony, you've got the wrong lady. Hyun looked down at the paper, then back at her. To her surprise, he didn't look offended. He looked like a man who had just been given the greatest gift of his life. Lillian, he said, his voice dropping into that low, soulful hum. I spent my life surrounded by people who wanted my power. I have finally found the only person who wants her own. I don't want a queen who waves. I want a partner who leads. He reached across the table, not to take her hand this time, but to pick up a pen. He signed the bottom of her contract with the same flourish he used for billion-dollar mergers. Now, he whispered, sliding the sapphire ring toward her again. Will you marry me, Lillian Joseph? Not as my shadow, but as my equal? Lillian looked at the ring, then at the man. She felt 60 years of not yet, and too late, evaporate into the tea-scented air. She picked up the ring and slipped it onto her finger herself. I think, she smiled, her eyes bright with a new fierce light, that we have a lot of work to do. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Seoul was no longer a room. It was a cathedral of light. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, their scent mingling with the crisp, expensive perfume of the city's elite. The event of the decade had drawn every camera lens in Asia, but inside the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere was strangely, beautifully intimate. Lillian stood behind the double doors, her heart steady. She wore a gown of structured champagne-colored silk with a high architectural collar that framed her face like a portrait. Her silver hair hadn't been dyed or hidden. It had been woven into a sophisticated, shimmering crown, punctuated by small, raw sapphires. Beside her, her daughter, who had flown in from London with tear-filled eyes, squeezed her hand. You look like a revolution, Mom. Lillian smiled. I feel like myself, baby. Finally, the music shifted. Not a traditional march, but a soulful orchestral arrangement of the old Southern hymn her mother used to hum. The doors swung open. A sea of faces turned. The board members who had doubted her, the socialites who had mocked her, and the public who had questioned her. They all fell silent. Lillian didn't walk with the hesitant gait of a woman apologizing for her age. She moved with the rhythmic grace of a woman who had walked the shore of Busan and the streets of Atlanta and knew exactly where she was going. At the end of the aisle stood Hyun. He wasn't the lion of Seoul tonight. He was just a man in a black tuxedo, his eyes unashamedly wet as he watched his partner approach. When she reached him, he didn't wait for the officiant. He took both of her hands and whispered, "Welcome home." The ceremony was short, focusing not on the merger of empires, but on the meeting of souls. When they turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, the applause wasn't just polite. It was a roar of recognition. 6 months later, Incheon International Airport was as chaotic as ever, a blur of neon and hurried travelers. But at the VIP terminal, the pace was different. Lillian and Hyun walked through the glass corridors toward their gate. Lillian wore a tailored travel suit and a pair of chic spectacles, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She had been reviewing the first quarter reports for the Ginger Tree Foundation all morning. They reached the jet bridge. A young gate agent looked at their tickets, her eyes widening as she recognized the chairman and his wife. She bowed 90 degrees, her voice trembling. "Welcome, Chairman. Welcome, Madam. It is an honor." Lillian gave the girl a warm, genuine smile, the kind of smile that made the agent feel seen. "Thank you, sugar. It's a beautiful day for a flight." They stepped into the first-class cabin. It was a palace of leather and quiet, but as they sat down, Lillian's mind drifted back to seat 44K. She looked at the man beside her, who was already reaching for her hand. "Where to first, Mrs. Kang?" Hyun asked, his eyes dancing. Lillian pulled her passport from her bag. It was no longer the stiff, terrifying bomb it had been a year ago. The navy cover was softened by use, the gold crest worn from the friction of many hands. She flipped through the pages, stamps from Japan, France, South Africa, and the thick red ink of her Korean residency. She turned to the very back, where her mother's list was tucked. The list was almost entirely crossed out. Only one remained: the Northern Lights. "Iceland," Lillian said, her voice a soft, certain bell. The engines began their low, powerful thrum, vibrating through the floorboards. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Lillian looked down at her hands. They were still. No tremors, no cold sweat. They were the hands of a woman who had found her own power, and a man worthy of holding it. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, tilting its nose toward the clouds, Lillian leaned her head onto Hyun's shoulder. She watched the city of Seoul shrink beneath them, a tapestry of light and memory. She wasn't running away anymore. She was simply traveling. "You know," she whispered, as they broke through the cloud layer into the eternal sun, "60 is a wonderful age for a beginning." Hyun kissed the top of her silver crown. "It's the only age that matters." Lillian closed her eyes, the passport resting safely in her lap, and for the first time in her life, she fell asleep before the plane even reached cruising altitude. The corner office of the Ginger Tree Foundation did not look like a corporate stronghold. It looked like a library in the middle of a garden. High in a glass tower overlooking the Han River, the walls were lined with books in both English and Korean, and the air smelled of roasted barley tea and fresh lilies. Lillian sat at her desk, reviewing a loan application for a 65-year-old woman named Minna, who wanted to open a small pottery studio after 40 years of working in a dry cleaner. Lillian didn't just look at the credit score. She looked at the photos of the pottery. "She has the hands of an artist," Lillian murmured, marking the file with the green approved stamp. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Secretary Cho, now the Chief Operations Officer of Lillian's foundation. He walked in with a tablet, but his usual stoic expression was replaced by a look of genuine warmth. "The first class of the second spring program is graduating today, madam," Cho said. 50 women, all over the age of 55. 3 of them have already been scouted by the Kang Group's legal department. Lillian stood up, her silk skirt swishing against the floor. "Let's not keep them waiting, Cho. I know what it feels like to wait too long for someone to notice you." As she walked through the halls of the foundation, she passed the wall of visibility. It wasn't a wall of donors. It was a gallery of portraits of older women from all walks of life: Black, Korean, American, European, all of them glowing under professional lights, their wrinkles celebrated as maps of wisdom. In the center of the wall hung a small framed yellow wrapper, the original ginger candy wrapper from Flight KE-36. She reached the auditorium, where 50 women sat with their heads held high. They were no longer the invisible grandmothers of Seoul. They were accountants, coders, writers, and entrepreneurs. At the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe to stay out of the spotlight, stood Hyun. He wasn't there as the chairman. He was there as her husband. When their eyes met, he gave her a small, private nod of his head, a gesture of such profound respect that it still made Lillian's breath catch. He had kept his promise. He hadn't just given her a palace. He had given her the world, and then stood back so she could conquer it. Lillian stepped onto the podium. She didn't need a script. She looked out at the women, her silver hair catching the afternoon sun. "They will tell you that you are a sunset," Lillian said, her voice steady and clear, echoing in the silent room. "They will tell you that your best chapters have already been written and that your job now is to simply close the book. But I am here to tell you that 60 is not an ending. It is a vantage point. From here, you can see exactly where you want to go, and you finally have the courage to walk there." She raised her hand, the blue sapphire on her finger sparkling. "Welcome to your second spring. The world has been waiting for you to show up." As the room erupted into applause, Lillian looked toward the window. Far off in the distance, a plane was ascending, its silver wings cutting through the blue sky. She smiled. The invisible woman was gone. The chairman's wife was a title. But Lillian Joseph? She was finally, undeniably, home. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.